"Stop right there! Your family isn't boarding this flight!" The flight attendant snapped, blocking the gate with a smug smile. Passengers turned to watch some whispering others recording as the stunned black family stood frozen in disbelief. The humiliation was sharp, the injustice blatant. But what no one, not even the smug attendant, knew was that a single phone call could unleash a storm that would ground the entire flight and leave the airline scrambling for answers. And that call was about to be made. Flight attendant refuses to let a black family board. Then they make one call and flight stops. They walked up to the gate, calm, respectful, holding first-class tickets and a small gift for their grandmother. But the flight attendant didn't even look twice. She told them to move aside, said they didn't belong up front, and blocked them without checking a single pass. The mother stayed silent. The kids held back tears. But the father, he said just 5 quiet words. "I'll make one phone call." No shouting, no scene, just one call. Minutes later, the plane stopped boarding. The captain came out, and the woman who thought she ran everything was the one being escorted out. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new one. She stood behind the gate counter with a stiff smile and an even stiffer posture. Sarah Coleman had worked this airline long enough to think she knew exactly who belonged in first class and who didn't. She scanned each ticket like she was granting a personal favor, barely glancing at the passengers before waving them through. Then a family stepped forward, 4 well-dressed black passengers, quiet, respectful, and calm. Stephen, the father, wore a navy wool coat and carried a sleek carry-on. His wife, Teresa, had a soft cashmere scarf wrapped around her shoulders and a small gold gift bag in hand. Their son, Daniel, maybe 15, stood tall and quiet, while their younger daughter, Alana, clutched her backpack and looked around curiously. Her free hand held tightly in her mother's. Stephen offered a polite nod and handed over the boarding passes. Clara took one look at them, then at the family, and her smile tightened. Without scanning a single ticket, she handed them back. "Economy is boarding at Gate 6, she said, gesturing toward the far end of the terminal. Teresa frowned gently. "These are first-class tickets." Clara barely blinked. "I'm sure they are, but there must be a mistake. First class is reserved for elite passengers." Stephen didn't flinch. "We're platinum level. Please scan the passes." Clara hesitated, then took one ticket and scanned it. The green light beeped. She scanned another. Same result. Her face didn't change. "The system probably glitched," she said quickly. "Sometimes it reads things wrong. You'll need to wait over there while we confirm." Alana looked up at her mother, confused. "Why can't we go in?" she asked softly. Teresa crouched beside her daughter, smoothing her hair. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just hold the gift." "All right." Stephen stayed perfectly still, his jaw clenched slightly, but his voice remained steady. "There's nothing to confirm. Our seats are valid. You've scanned them." Clara folded her arms. "Sir, I'm asking you to step aside so I can finish boarding." "No," Stephen replied firmly. "You're refusing us for no reason." People in line began shifting uncomfortably. A businessman behind them pretended to check his phone, but didn't look away. A woman further back whispered to her companion, glancing toward the gate. Clara leaned in slightly. "If you make this harder than it needs to be, you won't be getting on at all." Stephen pulled out his phone without another word, stepped to the side, and dialed. He spoke quietly. "Yes, there's a situation. Gate 4. She's refusing boarding without cause." "Yes, all 4 tickets scanned." No explanation. Clara scoffed loud enough for people to hear. Of course, always a phone call. She rolled her eyes and turned her back. Then the gate phone rang. The younger agent nearby, Ryan Mitchell, picked it up. His posture shifted. "Yes, sir. Yes, I understand." He hung up and walked briskly over to Clara. "You need to stop boarding," he said under his breath. Clara blinked. "What are you talking about? Supervisor's coming," he said to hold the flight. The boarding stopped. The line froze. The low airport chatter around them suddenly felt miles away. The family didn't move. They stood together in silence. Not one of them raised a voice. Not one of them argued. They just waited. And every second that passed, every watching eye, every uneasy whisper made it clear something bigger had just been set in motion. The silence around Gate 4 grew heavier. With every second, Clara's face flushed with confusion, but she held her ground. She turned to Ryan Mitchell, her voice low and sharp. "You don't take orders from passengers' phone calls, Ryan." Mitchell didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the far end of the jet bridge, where two figures had just come into view. One in a dark blue suit, and the other in a red-striped airport operations jacket. Passengers began to shift again, some stepping to the side to get a clearer view, others whispering now without trying to hide it. One woman pulled out her phone, pretending to check messages, but already recording, Clara stood straighter, her smile returning like armor as the two men approached. The man in the suit walked with a calm, calculated pace. His badge read, "David Thompson, Regional Flight Operations Director." The one in the red-striped jacket, Carlos Rivera, was the airline's ground supervisor. Neither of them smiled. "Clara," Henry said, his voice measured, "step away from the counter." Clara hesitated. "Sir, there's been a mistake. This family tried to board first class." Henry raised a hand. "Did you check their tickets?" She paused, realizing her answer mattered more than she thought. "Yes, two of them." But Louise cut her off. "Were they valid?" Clara nodded reluctantly. "They scanned green, but I thought." Henry looked past her toward the family still standing quietly just a few feet away. He turned back to Clara. "You thought wrong." He stepped to the podium, pulled up the passenger manifest, and tapped the screen. Ryan Mitchell stepped beside him, pointing to the names Stephen, Teresa, Daniel, and Sophie Harris, all listed under Priority Elite. 4 confirmed seats, row 1A through 1D. Clara's mouth opened, but no words came out. Louise turned to Ryan Mitchell. "Start reboarding, let them through first." Ryan Mitchell nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." As the gate doors reopened and the boarding resumed, Clara stood frozen behind the counter. Her authority had been stripped in front of everyone, without yelling, without argument, without a scene. Stephen gave a slight nod as Ryan Mitchell welcomed the family forward. Teresa guided Alana gently ahead, the girl still clutching the gold gift bag. Daniel followed behind one hand, brushing the edge of his blazer as if straightening it out of instinct. As they passed Clara, not one of them looked at her. Not once. But the weight of their silence pressed harder than anything she'd heard all day. Clara's heart pounded. The pit in her stomach deepened, and as the family disappeared down the jet bridge, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Uncertainty. Something wasn't right. Something bigger than a mistake had just happened, and the worst part, she didn't know who had been on the other end of that phone call. But whoever it was, they had just taken control of everything. Inside the aircraft, the cabin crew had just finished preparing first class. The cabin smelled of fresh linen and citrus cleaner. Flight attendants adjusted pillows and tucked in headsets, moving quickly before the rest of the passengers arrived. Everything seemed routine until the jet bridge door opened and Ryan Mitchell stepped in, ushering the Moore family forward. Stephen led his family quietly into the cabin. Teresa followed behind him, holding Alana's hand, while Daniel walked with steady steps, his eyes scanning the polished wood panels and white leather seats. They placed their bags in the overhead compartments without assistance. There were no questions, no commotion. They simply took their seats, 1A to 1D, as they were always meant to. The lead flight attendant. Emily Parker glanced up from her final checks. She was about to offer a greeting, but stopped the moment she saw Ryan Mitchell step in behind them, looking nervous. Rachel walked over, lowering her voice. "What's going on?" she asked Ryan. Mitchell leaned in. David Thompson and the ground team just escorted them through. Clara denied them boarding. "There was a call made." His voice dropped further from someone high up, like really high up. Rachel's eyes widened. She looked toward the family now, buckling in silent and composed. They didn't look angry. They didn't even look bothered. But there was something about them. Something still like they were waiting for the next part of a plan that hadn't revealed itself yet. Back at the gate, Clara hadn't moved. She stood near the corner of the counter, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. Her heart raced, but her pride kept her from showing it. Luis returned to the desk, holding his tablet. "Go take a seat near the crew area," he said flatly. "Mr. Walker will speak with you after the flight." Clara raised an eyebrow. "I'm still working this flight." "No, Clara, you're not," Luis replied. "You've been removed from active duty until further notice." "What for what one mistake?" Luis didn't answer. He just nodded to the standby flight attendant who was already approaching, ready to take Clara's place. Clara's mouth opened to protest, but she saw passengers watching phones pointed discreetly, whispers moving through the line like wind. Her face burned. She didn't say another word. Instead, she stepped away from the desk and slumped into the crew seat near the far side of the gate. Inside the aircraft, Rachel approached the Moore family again. This time, she bowed her head slightly. "If there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable," she said gently. Stephen gave her a polite smile. "You've already done more than enough. Thank you." Rachel nodded once, then moved away. She didn't press, didn't ask questions, but she felt it too now that something unspoken had shifted in the air. The boarding continued, but the mood was different. Passengers filed in, more carefully aware that something strange had just happened at the gate. A few gave awkward glances toward the front row, quickly looking away when they noticed Stephen watching. And then, as the doors began to close and the cabin settled, a quiet message appeared on Rachel's tablet screen. A direct message from corporate operations. 5 simple words. "Expect contact from executive office." She looked up sharply. Something was coming, and it wasn't small. The aircraft door sealed shut with a heavy click, followed by the soft chime of final cabin checks. As the engines began to hum and the crew moved through safety demonstrations, Rachel kept one eye on her tablet. She had worked dozens of flights, seen plenty of mid-air incidents and last-minute changes, but she had never seen a message come through like that. No explanation, no context, just those 5 words from the highest level of airline command. She glanced toward the Moore family. Stephen sat quietly, one leg crossed, fingers laced over his knee, watching the flight crew with calm precision. Teresa gently stroked Alana's hair as the girl leaned on her shoulder. Daniel had pulled out a book, but hadn't flipped a single page. He was listening, watching like his father. The family wasn't tense. They weren't upset. They were waiting. Rachel walked to the front galley, tapped the intercom button, and asked to speak to the captain. Within moments, Captain James Carter stepped out tall and seasoned, the kind of man whose presence brought a natural hush to any room. Rachel handed him the tablet. He read the message, eyes narrowing. "Executive office," he said quietly. "This came straight through." She nodded. "It's connected to what happened during boarding. The family in 1A through 1D. The gate agent denied them. Someone made a call. Since then, everything's changed." Captain James Carter glanced toward the family, then back at the tablet. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "I'll contact dispatch," he said, and returned to the cockpit. Back in the crew jump seat, Clara sat, rigid arms locked across her chest. Every few minutes, she caught glances from other passengers or heard muffled laughter from those clearly talking about her. One man even walked past her and muttered just loud enough, "Still got your badge, huh?" She ignored them, staring straight ahead. Her chest burned with embarrassment, but her mind was racing. Why had the flight stopped for them? Who had that kind of influence? A call can't stop an entire aircraft unless it comes from her stomach sink. She'd made assumptions, yes, but she'd done it 100 times before. No one had ever challenged her like this. Passengers usually got angry, maybe filed a complaint, but this wasn't a complaint. This was something else. Up in the cockpit, the captain's call was answered almost instantly. On the other end, not dispatch, not even the usual line supervisor. A calm, deliberate voice came through. "This is Robert Clean, Chief of Airline Strategy. We understand you have 4 passengers seated in 1A to 1D. Please confirm," the captain replied with a clear, steady tone. Confirmed. Family of 4 all seated and settled. Issue reported from boarding. Martin's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to maintain current flight plan. When you land, keep all crew on board. Do not release them until directed. Ground response team will be waiting. And Captain, yes sir, tell your lead flight attendant to remain alert. The person who placed the call isn't just anyone. He's our major shareholder, the man who signed our last merger deal. His name is Michael Harris. The line went silent. The captain sat back slowly, eyes wide now. He looked through the cockpit door window at the man seated in 1A, calm, collected, unreadable, and then he understood. This flight had already changed, and they hadn't even left the ground. The plane lifted into the sky with a smooth, steady climb. Passengers settled into their seats, the low hum of conversation blending with the gentle whir of the engines. But in first class, no one spoke. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was measured, controlled. Stephen leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, but not asleep. Teresa gently unfolded a blanket over Alana, who had already begun to drift off. Daniel sat still, staring out the window, his expression unreadable. Rachel moved through the cabin, offering water, but her hands weren't as steady as usual. She kept stealing glances at the family. Every time she passed, she felt a pressure in her chest, like she wasn't just serving drinks anymore, but walking through something far more important than she understood. In the rear crew jump seat, Clara's legs bounced nervously. She had tried to keep her face blank, but the whispers hadn't stopped. Even crew members were beginning to shift their behavior. No one looked at her directly. No one asked for her input. She had become invisible, except for the constant heat of judgment pressing in from all sides. Finally, she stood up and approached Rachel near the galley. "I need to speak to the captain," she whispered, trying to sound composed. Rachel didn't even blink. "You're not allowed on the flight deck." "This is serious," Clara hissed. "I need to explain what happened before this gets blown out of." "It's already blown out," Rachel said quietly, cutting her off. Clara stood frozen. Rachel lowered her voice further. "Do you even know who that man is?" Clara didn't answer. "He's not just flying for leisure. He's the reason we're all getting paid next month. His signature is on every fleet expansion, and you stopped him. His family from boarding his own airline." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but there was nothing to say. She had nothing. Rachel turned away, leaving Clara standing alone near the drink cart. That moment, that heavy, cold moment, was when it finally settled in. This wasn't about a seat. This wasn't about a policy. This was about judgment, and hers had just ended her career. Back in the cockpit, Captain James Carter sat in silence, eyes locked on the horizon, but mind turning over every word from the executive call. He had never received mid-air instructions to retain crew after landing. That only happened when there was a legal violation or a top-tier internal case. And this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. He glanced down at his screen. Another message had come through. "Prepare incident statement. Internal Affairs will conduct interviews upon arrival, all communications to be logged." That was the moment he realized. The real turbulence hadn't even started yet. The hours passed slowly. The plane cut through calm skies, but inside the air felt heavier with every mile. First class remained unusually quiet. Even the passengers who typically ordered wine or asked for extra pillows seemed cautious, unsure how to behave. Every one of them had seen what happened at the gate, and every one of them had felt the shift when the Moore family boarded. When they realized this wasn't just any family, Stephen hadn't moved much since takeoff. He sat upright, eyes forward, silent, not cold, not arrogant, just still like a man who knew exactly how things would unfold. Teresa leaned her head against the window, watching clouds pass her hand, resting gently on Alana's shoulder. Daniel had finally opened his book but seemed to be reading the same page for the last 20 minutes. Rachel, making another quiet round with warm towels, hesitated near them. She paused, then bent slightly towards Stephen. "If you or your family need anything at all, please don't hesitate." Stephen turned to her, meeting her eyes for the first time. His expression was calm, but it carried weight. "You've been kind," he said simply. "That's enough." Rachel offered a soft nod and continued down the aisle, her heart pounding. That man didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. She'd served executives before, some loud, some difficult, but none like this. Michael Harris had the kind of presence that didn't demand respect. It made people check themselves. Back in the rear crew section, Clara couldn't sit still anymore. She stood near the galley, arms crossed tightly, every part of her stiff with dread. She'd gone through her actions again and again in her head, how she'd looked at that family, how she'd assumed they were in the wrong, how she hadn't even scanned all 4 tickets before deciding they didn't belong. Her pride still tried to twist the narrative. It was just a misunderstanding. It was procedure. Anyone could have made the same call, but something deeper in her knew that wasn't true. She hadn't questioned because of policy. She'd questioned because of assumption. And now she was sitting in the back of the plane. She used to supervise the seat that was once hers, now filled by a junior attendant she had trained just months ago. The curtain that separated first class from the rest of the cabin had never felt so symbolic. She wasn't just physically removed. She had been pulled out of the world she believed she belonged in. The chatter among the rest of the crew was different, too. Normally, they'd joke quietly during cruise time, share snack packs, gossip about passengers, but today they barely spoke. And when they did, it wasn't to her. She overheard bits as they passed. He didn't even raise his voice. "HR is going to eat this alive." She really slapped away her whole career. She squeezed her hands into fists under the galley counter. The silence from leadership was worse than being yelled at. The call she expected from the supervisor never came. No support. No backup. Just a stillness that told her the damage was already done. Clara's eyes drifted to the front of the cabin. She couldn't see through the curtain, but she could feel them. Stephen, Teresa. The children calm, untouched, above the noise, above the judgment, above her. And in that moment, for the first time in all her years flying, Sarah Coleman realized something brutal. The people she once looked down on were the ones quietly watching her fall, and they didn't have to say a single word to make it happen. The hum of the engines filled the cabin like background music, but for Clara, it was louder than ever. Every minute felt like an hour. Every glance from her fellow crew members felt loaded. She had tried to keep her chin up, tried to act like this was just a small mix-up that would pass, but nothing passed. The silence around her kept thickening, and no one, not even the junior flight attendant she once scolded for folding napkins the wrong way, looked at her anymore. In the cockpit, Captain James Carter reviewed the latest directive, jaw clenched. A fresh message had appeared on the comm screen from Operations Oversight. Passenger Moore flagged as top executive priority, ensure incident. Report is fully submitted within 1 hour of landing legal team, and HR will meet crew at the gate. Mitchell rubbed his temple. He had flown senators, athletes, celebrities. But this was different. Michael Harris wasn't a celebrity. He didn't need the spotlight, but he owned the room the second he entered it, and Mitchell could feel it in his bones. This man wasn't looking for revenge. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to argue. He had already set the wheels in motion, and no one on this flight could stop them. Now back in first class, Daniel finally spoke. He leaned toward his father and asked, "Do you think she understands what she did?" Stephen didn't answer right away. He stared ahead, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Then he turned slightly to his son. "Understanding isn't something you hear in word," he said softly. You see it in silence. Daniel nodded once, then looked back out the window. Rachel, who had just passed row 2, heard it. She didn't mean to listen, but those words stuck in her chest. There was no bitterness in Stephen's voice, no anger, just a quiet truth that made everything around it feel smaller. She continued down the aisle and stopped in the galley where Tyler Evans, a young attendant on his 2nd month of flying, stood restocking cups. "Is it true?" he asked under his breath. "That's the Michael Harris, the shareholder." Rachel gave a small nod. Yes. He didn't say anything, the system confirmed it. Operations called the flight deck directly. Tyler Evban's eyes widened. "Wow, I heard she blocked them without scanning all the tickets." "She did." Rachel confirmed. Tyler Evans glanced toward the back. "She's done, isn't she?" Rachel didn't answer right away. She didn't want to take pleasure in someone else's fall. But the truth was, she had seen Clara make life miserable for junior staff for years, belittling them, correcting them in front of passengers, mocking those who didn't match her idea of first-class worthy. "She's not getting off this plane the same way she got on." Rachel said finally, "That much is certain." Meanwhile, Clara sat alone in her seat, trying to will time to move faster. Her hands gripped her armrest so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She had tried messaging her union rep earlier, but there was no signal. Her heart pounded harder with every update from the cockpit, every subtle shift in the crew's tone. Then Rachel appeared beside her, standing stiff and unreadable. Clara looked up, startled. "They want you in the front," Rachel said. Clara blinked now. Rachel nodded. "The captain says there's someone from corporate trying to connect. They want to speak with you directly." Clara stood slowly brushing off her uniform like it still meant something. Her legs felt heavy. Her mouth had gone dry. She followed Rachel toward the front. Each step down the narrow aisle feeling like a courtroom walk. As they reached the cockpit entrance, Captain James Carter stepped out holding a headset with a coiled cord. "They're waiting," he said, not unkindly, but with no softness either. Clara put the headset on. The line was quiet for a second. Then came a voice low, calm, and unmistakably confident. "Miss Tyler Evston, this is Thomas Grant from Corporate Ethics." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. "You're aware of the situation?" I assume Clara swallowed hard. "I didn't mean I thought." "Don't explain," the voice said evenly. "Not yet. Just listen." And Clara did. She stood there, headset pressed to her ear, while the man on the other end, someone who had never spoken to her before, spoke with total clarity. "Before this flight lands," he said, "you need to understand something. This is not a small matter. This is not a routine report. You made a decision that put the company at risk publicly, legally, and reputationally." Clara felt her breath catch. "You didn't just disrespect a passenger," the voice continued. "You disrespected the owner." And just like that, the last thread of control she'd been clinging to snapped. Clara stood there frozen at the cockpit doorway, headset still pressed against her ear, her spine stiff, her throat dry, her hands shaking just slightly, but she didn't dare let them fall from her sides. She listened as Thomas Grant from Corporate Ethics spoke with a level of calm that felt colder than any shout could ever be. "This isn't just about a delay," he said. "It's about the message your actions sent. And unfortunately, this isn't your first flag. There are past records, multiple crew complaints, 3 prior passenger reports, and at least 1 ignored warning from internal compliance." Clara opened her mouth to speak, but Raymond didn't stop. "You made a decision without verifying facts. You didn't check all 4 boarding passes. You didn't ask for supervisor clearance. You didn't follow protocol." He paused, but more than that, you judged them. The headset felt heavier on her ear with every sentence. Clara wanted to argue, to insist it wasn't like that, to say she was only trying to enforce procedure, but every excuse crumbled in her mouth before it could form. "You'll remain on this flight," Raymond continued. "Upon landing, you'll be escorted to the administrative office at the terminal. You are not to speak to media, fellow staff, or passengers. Security will be present. Do you understand?" Clara closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push down the wave of nausea rising in her chest. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, what? Yes, I understand." The line disconnected without a goodbye. She removed the headset slowly, her hands now clammy. Captain James Carter said nothing. He simply nodded toward the front jump seat near the cockpit and stepped back inside, shutting the door. Clara sat down like she was sitting on glass, her thoughts a mess of what-ifs and too late. Back in first class, the Moore family remained composed. Alana had drifted off with her head resting on her mother's lap, her hands still loosely holding the handle of the gold gift bag. Teresa adjusted her daughter's jacket gently, whispering something only mothers knew how to say. Stephen looked out the window, unreadable, his fingers resting near the armrest. Daniel finally set his book aside and leaned toward his mother. "Will she lose her job?" he asked quietly. Teresa didn't answer immediately. She looked at her son, then at her husband. Stephen spoke without turning his head. "She lost it the moment she thought she had more value than we did." Daniel nodded, though the weight of those words settled slowly. A few rows back, other first-class passengers whispered behind raised hands. One man, clearly uncomfortable, said they didn't even raise their voice. Just one call and everything changed. His companion replied, "That's what happens when someone powerful gets treated like they don't belong." Or the first man muttered, "When someone finally says enough." Even the flight attendants now moved with a strange tension, less chatter, more precision. Orders were taken quickly, but no one lingered. The energy had shifted. There was a new awareness in the cabin, an invisible pressure wrapped around the crew. Everyone could feel it. In the back galley, the junior flight attendant Tyler Evans whispered to Rachel, "Is it true she's getting pulled the second we land?" Rachel nodded. "Security's meeting. The flight admin wants her escorted before debriefing. She's not coming back from this, is she?" Rachel's voice was low. "No one comes back from offending the man who owns your airline." Clara sat forward now, hunched slightly, trying not to be noticed. She had once walked the cabin with confidence, correcting uniforms, scolding staff over meal prep, talking down to passengers she thought were out of place. But now she was invisible in the worst possible way. No one looked at her with respect, only pity or satisfaction or quiet, knowing judgment. She tried to breathe, but the air didn't feel like it belonged to her anymore. Her mind spiraled with thoughts of damage control. Maybe if she apologized publicly, maybe if she offered a written statement, maybe if she begged HR, but something inside her already knew. None of it would matter. Not to them, not to the passengers, and definitely not to Michael Harris. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. But with one call, one calm private call, he had changed her entire future, not with revenge, with consequence. And that Clara now realized was far more permanent. The flight neared its destination, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. Calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. Please fasten your seatbelts and make sure all tray tables are in their upright position. Flight attendants prepare the cabin for landing." To most passengers, it was a routine announcement, but for a handful of people on board, it marked something else entirely. For Clara, it was the beginning of the end. For Stephen, it was the quiet countdown to closure. And for the crew, it was the moment they had all been quietly bracing for. Since the gate call had turned the day upside down, Clara stared at the seatbelt sign as it lit up above her like it had a different meaning now. The seat beneath her suddenly felt too hard, her uniform too tight. The tension in her shoulders had turned to something almost unbearable. Shame mixed with fear, guilt wrapped in pride. She had never once doubted her place in this company, had never feared correction, let alone removal. But now she couldn't stop shaking, not on the outside, but inside where it mattered more. She replayed every second at the gate in her head again. The tone she used, the assumptions she made, the way she dismissed the family's explanation without a second thought. She hadn't even scanned the girl's ticket or the boys'. She just assumed because they didn't look the part, because in her mind, first class had a certain image and they didn't fit it, and now she didn't even fit in the jump seat. Rachel approached her slowly, quietly, holding a sealed envelope. This came down from the captain. She said, her voice dry. "They're waiting for you when we land, instructions inside." Clara took the envelope with trembling fingers. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She already knew what it said. "You know," Rachel added, almost gently, "there was a time you were one of the best on this crew." Clara looked up surprised. Rachel didn't smile. "You knew the rule book better than anyone, but you forgot something somewhere along the way." "What's that?" Clara's voice cracked. "That the rules are for protecting people, not judging them." She walked away before Clara could respond. At the front of the plane, the Moore family remained calm. Stephen looked out the window at the city skyline growing larger beneath them. Teresa wiped Alana's cheeks gently with a napkin. The little girl had slept most of the flight, unaware of the storm she had slept through. Daniel had taken out a notebook and was scribbling something. Maybe thoughts, maybe nothing, but his expression was focused. Teresa leaned toward Stephen and whispered, "Do you think she understands now?" Stephen answered without looking away from the window. "It's not about her understanding, it's about what others saw, what they remember." Teresa gave a soft nod. "Then maybe this mattered more than we think." Stephen turned to her eyes, tired but steady. "It mattered because it wasn't just about us. It was about every person like us who's been pushed aside, doubted, ignored. Today, someone saw what usually stays hidden, back in the galley." Tyler Evans watched the runway begin, to appear in the distance through the tiny window near the service door. He glanced toward Clara, then toward the closed curtain of first class. "Do you think he planned it?" he asked Rachel, "that he knew how far this would go?" Rachel folded a tray cloth and didn't answer right away. "Number, I think he hoped it wouldn't go that far. I think he gave her a chance to fix it." Tyler Evans nodded slowly. She didn't take it. "No," Rachel said. She doubled down. The plane dipped lower wheels, dropping into place with a mechanical wear. The cabin jolted softly. Passengers sat up straighter, fastening belts, placing items back into bags, the usual final movements before landing. But the mood was anything but usual. Stephen reached into the seat pocket and pulled out his phone. A single message glowed on the lock screen: "Legal team and press briefing scheduled, statement approved for release." He didn't respond. He locked the phone and set it aside. His part was done. And now the rest of the world would decide what to do with what they saw. As the plane approached the runway, Clara gripped the envelope in her hand. Her heart pounded. Her mouth was dry. Her future was gone. She knew that now, but what terrified her most wasn't just the job loss. It was that every passenger on this plane had just witnessed her final flight, and none of them would forget. The wheels touched the ground with a soft thud. But for Clara, it felt like the plane had slammed into concrete. The usual smattering of polite applause echoed briefly through the cabin. Habitual hollow and short-lived passengers began to stir, reaching for bags, stretching stiff limbs, chatting in soft tones. But there was no normally in Clara's world anymore. For her, this landing was not the end of a journey. It was the start of a reckoning. She sat still, envelope clenched tightly in her lap, her breathing shallow and uneven. Her name badge felt heavier than it ever had, and she was painfully aware of the way crew members avoided looking at her. Even Tyler Evans, the youngest, and usually the most eager to please, kept his eyes locked on the galley cabinet, pretending to rearrange cups that didn't need rearranging. From the front, Captain James Carter made his final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. The local time is 3:42 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our entire crew, we thank you for flying with us today." The ding of the seatbelt lights shutting off. triggered a new flurry of movement, but none of it involved Clara. She remained fixed in place, eyes glazed every second stretching longer than the last. At the front of the plane, Rachel pulled back the curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin. Stephen and his family sat still. Alana had woken up just moments before rubbing her eyes. Teresa whispered something softly to her, brushing her daughter's hair back with a mother's gentle grace. Daniel closed his notebook and tucked it neatly into his backpack. Stephen remained composed, his body relaxed, but his mind clearly focused. Rachel approached them. "Ground team has arrived," she said quietly. "They're waiting just outside the jet bridge." Stephen gave a nod. "Thank you." Rachel hesitated, then she leaned in slightly. "There's media outside too, just letting you know." Teresa looked at her husband. "You told them?" He shook his head. "I didn't have to. They're already watching everything." Passengers began to stand retrieving bags and filing toward the aisle, but no one rushed. No one shoved. Instead, they turned their heads, some slowly, some not so subtly, toward the front, toward the Moore family, and toward Clara. In a first class, one man in a blazer leaned toward Stephen. "I saw everything back at the gate," he said, voice low. "What you did, that was powerful." Stephen looked at him and replied calmly, "I didn't do anything. I just didn't let it go." Clara saw them now. Faces turned toward the front heads, turning people whispering. She knew the scene was being watched from every angle. A woman a few rows back even held her phone at chest level, the lens angled just enough to record. She didn't try to hide it. She didn't need to. Then the jet bridge door opened. There they were. Two security officers wearing black uniforms with silver trim stood flanking a woman in a sleek gray business suit. Her name tag read, Karen Walsh, Corporate Affairs. Her face was unreadable, but her presence screamed finality. Rachel stepped aside as Nora entered the plane. Her heels clicked softly against the flooring. She made eye contact with Rachel for a brief second, then with Captain James Carter, who had stepped out of the cockpit, Miss Tyler Evston. Nora's voice was neutral, polished. Clara stood slowly, her hands trembling. She clutched the envelope like a lifeline. "Please collect your personal items and follow us. You will be escorted directly to the administrative office." Clara looked around once at the passengers, at the crew, at the space she used to own. Rachel handed her a bag with her belongings neatly packed, already removed from the overhead bin. Clara took it without a word. Then came the walk down the aisle. She once marched with confidence past passengers. She had scolded, ignored, smiled at with fake grace, past the faces now watching her like she was a lesson, some with pity, some with satisfaction, many with judgment. As she reached first class, her eyes locked for a moment with Michael Harris. He didn't smirk. He didn't glare. He didn't need to. He looked at her the way someone looks at an old uniform, worn out, discarded, no longer fit for use. And just before she turned away, Teresa, still seated, spoke gently. Not mocking, not cruel, just calm. "I hope this teaches you more than it cost you." Clara's throat tightened. She nodded without replying, her face burning. Then she stepped through the open plane door, out of the aircraft, out of her role and out of the world she had built her identity around. The hallway beyond was lined with quiet people in dark suits and cold eyes. No applause this time, only silence, and the low sound of her footsteps fading behind her. The door to the jet bridge closed behind Clara with a thud that echoed louder in her mind than in the corridor. The moment her foot hit the carpeted floor of the terminal, it no longer felt like an airport. It felt like a stage, a silent, sterile hallway where every step was observed, recorded, and remembered. The two security officers didn't touch her, but they stayed close enough to make their purpose clear. Nora walked ahead heels, clicking in steady rhythm, leading the way with the precision of someone used to cleaning up disasters. Clara followed like a shadow behind her shoulders, hunched eyes cast low, hoping no one else recognized her. But of course they did. Even in the brief stretch between the gate and the elevator, eyes found her. Two gate agents stood near the terminal counter, whispering under their breath. One of them, someone Clara had once publicly corrected for using the wrong intercom phrase, looked directly at her now. Not with malice, just quiet, stunned awareness. The elevator doors opened, and Nora stepped inside. Clara followed without a word. The moment the doors shut, the silence grew heavier. Clara glanced at Nora, who stood with her tablet in one hand, never looking up. Can I speak to someone from HR before this goes any further?" she asked. Nora didn't look at her. "You'll be speaking to them in about 10 minutes. I mean, informally, Clara," added voice tight. "There's nothing informal about what just happened," Nora replied, voice and flat. "You'll be processed according to company procedure. Legal and compliance are already involved. Your file has been pulled. Your access has been revoked." Clara felt her stomach turn. "You don't understand. I didn't do it out of hate. I made a judgment call." Nora turned her head slightly, eyes calm, "and that judgment cost you everything." The elevator chimed. The doors opened onto a quiet corridor, frosted glass walls, soft carpet, and muted overhead lighting. Clara had been in this part of the terminal before, but only during training years ago. Back then it had felt clean and impressive. Now it felt cold and final. They walked past a receptionist who gave Nora a nod. No words were exchanged. Clara followed her through a side door into a small, windowless conference room. Inside sat a man in a navy blue suit, Nathan Brooks, a human resources supervisor, young, polite, and painfully efficient. A sealed folder rested on the table before him, already thick with documents. "Miss Tyler Evston," Ethan said, not unkindly, "please have a seat." Clara lowered herself into the chair opposite him. Nora remained by the door, standing still. Ethan opened the folder and pulled out a stack of forms. "You're being formally removed from duty effective immediately. This document outlines your termination based on conduct violation, including failure to follow procedure, mistreatment of passengers, and damage to the airline's public image." Clara's mouth fell open, but I wasn't given a warning. I didn't even know who he was. Ethan's tone didn't change. "It's not about who he is, it's about what you did." The status of the passenger only escalated the response, but the action itself, your assumptions, your words, your refusal to verify, those are the violations. Clara stared at the papers, the bold title at the top, Termination of Employment Final Notice. She tried to steady her breathing, to slow her thoughts, to form a sentence that might save her. "I've been with this airline for 12 years, and in that time," Ethan said gently, "you've received multiple flags, behavior notes, passenger concerns, nothing serious enough to remove you until now." Clara shook her head, gripping the edge of the table. "You're going to fire me because of one mistake." Ethan met her eyes for the first time. "We're not firing you for one mistake. We're firing you because this mistake revealed something we can't ignore anymore." The room went quiet. Clara couldn't think. Her hands felt numb. She wanted to speak, but every word she could have said felt too small now. "Please sign here," Ethan said, sliding the form toward her. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the pen. She paused over the signature line, a last flicker of hope blinking behind her eyes. "Is there anything I can do?" Ethan didn't flinch. "You can sign?" She signed. He slid another form across the table. "You'll also return your badge, access card, and uniform. You will be escorted to the employee center to collect your belongings. You are not to contact current employees without clearance." Clara nodded slowly. "What happens after that?" Ethan closed the folder. "You leave, and the more family?" she asked softly. "What happens with them?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at Nora, who finally spoke. They're not pressing charges. They're not filing a lawsuit. They didn't have to. What they did was far more permanent. Clara blinked. What do you mean? Nora leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now. They showed restraint. They didn't yell. They didn't threaten. They made a single phone call, and that call showed everyone from top to bottom how powerful quiet dignity can be. Clara sat back in her chair, her heart breaking in slow, painful silence. And in that silence, she finally understood what Stephen had taught everyone on that plane. Loud doesn't equal strength. Position doesn't equal power. And silence, when held with truth, can change everything. Clara stepped out of the conference room with her badge, removed her access card deactivated, and a final copy of her termination letter folded neatly in the crook of her arm like a death certificate. Her hands shook as she held her travel bag tightly, knuckles pale under the fluorescent lighting. It was all real now, not a warning, not a suspension, not a temporary misstep. She had been removed, not just from the flight, but from the very industry she had built her identity. Around, Nora walked ahead silently, leading her down another hallway toward the crew center. The two security officers remained nearby, still quiet, still polite, still present. Clara didn't resist. There was nothing left to resist. Each hallway they passed through was more humiliating than the last. The terminal buzzed on the other side of the glass walls, passengers laughing, rolling suitcases, rushing toward flights, boarding announcements ringing through the air. Just another day at the airport. But for Clara, it was the longest walk of her life. They entered the crew center through a back door, one she'd used 100 times before when she arrived early to brief junior attendants or enforce last-minute uniform checks. It used to feel like her space. Now it felt like foreign ground. Inside, a young man from operations handed her a plastic bin labeled with her name. Inside were her spare uniform pieces, her badge pouch, a half-used notepad with scribbled reminders, and a coffee mug that said, "Cabin Boss, It." Made her chest ache just to look at it. Nora stood off to the side, reviewing something on her tablet, giving Clara space, but not too much. Clara turned to her. Is anyone going to talk to me about next steps? Severance. HR follow-up. Nora didn't look up. You'll receive a packet by mail. Your employee file has been flagged. As per policy, you're barred from employment at any airline partnered under our corporate network. Clara's breath caught. Flagged Nora met her eyes now. Red level. That means you're not eligible for rehire in this industry. This incident, along with your behavioral history, has triggered permanent classification. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. But that's for employees who are no longer trusted to represent the values of the company. Nora finished, and to protect passengers from repeat misconduct. Clara sank onto a bench in the corner of the room. For a long time, she said nothing, just stared at the contents of the bin like they belonged to someone else. 12 years of flights, thousands of hours in the air, all reduced to one plastic box in a final form. Her mind tried to reach for anything, any excuse, any defense, any detail she could hold on to. She had been proud of her work. She had trained new hires. She had memorized every policy. She had been sharp, fast, strict, but never kind. She had dismissed people based on how they dressed, how they spoke, how they moved. She had corrected passengers who didn't need correcting. She had assumed. And this time, her assumption had been aimed at the wrong family. Not just because of who they were, but because of what they had the strength not to do. They didn't yell, they didn't threaten, they didn't even demand an apology. They made one call and the world around Clara shifted forever. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. For a second, her heart jumped. Maybe someone from management. Maybe someone ready to say it had gone too far. But when she pulled it out, the screen showed one name, Jessica Hayes, a former colleague she hadn't spoken to in over a year. Clara answered quickly, desperate for a familiar voice. Hello? There was a pause, then a hesitant voice. I saw the footage. Clara swallowed. It's not what it looks like. I didn't mean it the way they're making it sound. Another paused. Jessica. Hayes' voice dropped to a whisper. Clara Ara. They didn't say anything. That's the problem. You did all the damage before anyone opened their mouth. Clara's mouth opened to speak, but the line had already gone dead. She stared at the phone still pressed to her ear. For the first time in a long, long time, there were no defenses left, no policy to quote, no tone to correct, no crew to order. She was alone. Nora looked over, ready to go. Clara nodded, stood, and picked up the bin. They exited through a side corridor that led directly to the employee parking structure. The security officers followed silently until they reached the exit doors. Nora turned to Clara one last time. You're not banned from flying as a passenger, she said, but don't wear your uniform. Again. And don't expect silence from the media. Clara stepped outside into the harsh daylight. The air hit her hard, as if the sky itself had changed. She walked toward the parking lot, not knowing where to go, not knowing what to do next, only knowing one thing with painful clarity. The Moore family didn't just walk onto a plane that day. They walked into her life and showed her what true power looks like when it doesn't raise its voice. And now, with nothing left to hide behind, Sarah Coleman would have to face the one thing she had always believed: she was above accountability. Clara sat in her car for what felt like hours, the engine-off keys still clenched in her hand. The sun had begun to shift across the parking lot, casting long shadows through her windshield. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Her bag sat beside her, the box of her belongings in the back seat, silent final reminders of a job she no longer had in a world that had spit her out. She had once believed this place was hers. The uniform, the seniority, the reputation. She walked terminals with confidence, spoke to passengers with command-enforced rules with pride. She believed she'd earned it all, that she belonged at the top of the chain. That first class was a space she had the right to protect. But the truth had crept in slowly over the last few hours, like water finding its way through cracks. What she'd protected wasn't the airline. It wasn't safety, it wasn't professionalism, it was her ego. It was the small, quiet voice in her head that told her she could decide who belonged. And when that voice was challenged, she didn't reconsider. She dug in. And now she was sitting in a car that felt like a box, unable to drive, unable to think, completely alone. She opened her phone, scrolling through contacts, people she once led on flights, co-workers. She had trained supervisors she had worked with. Some had reached out earlier with vague texts. I'm sorry. Are you okay? Rough day? But as the story spread, the silence grew. She tapped a name. Mark. Sullivan, her longtime colleague, someone who'd shared dozens of long-haul flights with her. It rang once, twice, then straight to voicemail. She tried another Amy Larson, someone she once mentored. Voicemail again. One more, Chris Bennett, the attendant she defended during an in-flight incident years ago. Sorry, this number is unavailable. The industry was small. News traveled faster than truth. Clara set the phone down slowly, her eyes welling up, not from injustice, not from outrage, but from the terrifying realization that this wasn't just a firing, it was an eraser. She tried to open her email, hoping for some sort of message. Anything from HR, anything official. But instead, a flood of alerts greeted her screen: news articles, social media mentions, a blurry photo of her standing at the gate. Another of her walking off the plane head low, flanked by security. Flight attendant removed after refusing to let family board first class. CEO's quiet power move leaves crew members speechless. They made one call. Viral. Moment sparks industry-wide conversation on bias. She scrolled further. Comments from people she didn't know. Strangers. She got what she deserved. The calmness of that man, chilling in the best way. Imagine thinking you have power until the real owner speaks up. She looked so sure of herself until she wasn't. Each comment was another cut, another truth she had tried to ignore. She opened the article and saw it, a quote from one of the passengers who had witnessed everything. He didn't yell, he didn't cause a scene. He just said, "I'll make a call." And then everything stopped. She closed her eyes. That was the moment. The moment everything changed. And yet all he had done was pick up a phone, no threats, no lawsuits, no social media rants, one call, one sentence, one man choosing dignity over drama. She remembered the way he had looked at her, not with anger, not even with contempt, but with the kind of calm disappointment that pierced deeper than rage ever could. It was the way her father used to look at her when she did something selfish, the way a teacher looks when you betray their trust, the way people look at you when you've lost something you can never earn back. Clara pressed her head against the steering wheel, her breath shallow, the weight of everything finally sinking in. She hadn't just lost her job. She had lost her place in a world she thought she understood. She could still hear Teresa's voice, soft and unshaken. "I hope this teaches you more than it cost you." She hadn't understood it then. She had been too angry, too humiliated. But now, alone in the quiet, she finally did. This wasn't just about her mistake. It was about what it revealed. And for the first time in her life, Sarah Coleman saw herself not as the powerful, composed flight attendant she had always imagined, but as someone who had been given power and used it recklessly, and the only people who truly paid for it were the ones who didn't even raise their voices. Clara sat parked for what must have been hours, long after most of the terminal had emptied and the sun had dipped beneath the edge of the horizon. Darkness settled in the sky, the airport's floodlights casting long shadows across the nearly vacant lot. She still hadn't turned the ignition key. She hadn't even reached for it. The heaviness inside her chest didn't let up. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was something worse, something deeper. It was the realization that she had become everything she used to despise in others. The kind of employee who made quick judgments, who acted with arrogance, who refused to see people as more than appearances. She'd always prided herself on keeping things professional, on maintaining standards. But those phrases now echoed hollow in her mind. What she called professionalism had become habit. What she called standards had turned into walls she built to exclude others. And on that day, she didn't see a family. She saw a disruption, a threat to her control, and she acted on that. Her phone lit up again with more news alerts. One article now included a brief statement from the airline. She opened it, slowly, reading each word like a sentence being handed down. "We do not tolerate behavior that violates the values of inclusivity and respect. This incident is under full review, and immediate steps have already been taken to address the matter in accordance with company policy. We extend our deepest apologies to the Moore family. They didn't name her. They didn't need to. Everyone already knew." She scrolled further. A video had been posted by one of the passengers. A shaky but clear recording taken during the confrontation at the gate. The sound was clear. It showed her voice sharp and dismissive, telling the family to stand aside and wait for rebooking. The children's faces were visible, the discomfort, the confusion, the calmness of the father as he quietly said, "If you're sure about this, I'll make the call." The comments were brutal, but not undeserved. She closed the app and stared ahead. For years, Clara had believed that experience gave her the right to assert control. That seniority allowed for certainty. But the truth was now painfully obvious. None of that meant anything. Without humility, without respect, without the ability to pause and think before deciding someone's worth. She thought back to moments she had brushed off without thinking. Passengers asked to switch seats because they didn't look like they belonged there. People questioned for being too casually dressed in business class, quiet families spoken to like intruders. She'd never hit anyone, never shouted, but she'd made them feel small. She'd made them feel less. And now the industry she had committed her life to, where she once felt powerful, respected and control, had closed its doors on her completely. Clara reached for her badge again out of instinct, only to remember it wasn't clipped to her uniform anymore. It was in the bin in her back seat. It wasn't hers to wear now. She glanced at the seat next to her. Her cabin boss mug sat face up, the lettering bold and cruel. She picked it up, stared at it for a moment, then opened the car door, stepped out into the cold night, and dropped it into the trash bin nearby without ceremony. The sound of the porcelain shattering at the bottom echoed up from the metal walls, a sound more final than she expected. She leaned against her car and looked up at the night sky. Planes cut through the air above her, just distant blinking lights. Now somewhere up there, another crew was serving drinks, adjusting seatbelts, preparing for landing. Somewhere another family might be traveling. Maybe another gate agent would make a decision like hers. Or maybe not. Maybe someone had seen the video. Maybe someone had read the comments. Maybe someone had paused before speaking too quickly, before letting bias pretend to be procedure. Maybe someone would learn from her failure. And that, Clara thought, was the only thing left that mattered. Not her career, not her reputation, not her record, but whether someone somewhere could look at what she had done and say, "I won't be like her." She sank back into the car, started the engine this time, and let it idle. The headlights cut across the rows of empty spaces, glowing against the asphalt. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, but she didn't drive yet. There was no plan, no direction, only the road ahead and the long, painful truth that sometimes the greatest losses aren't taken from you. They're what you throw away yourself, because you believed you were untouchable until someone showed you. You never were. The next morning, the world had already moved forward. News feeds refreshed with new headlines, airports buzzed with routine, planes departed, passengers boarded, and flight crews went about their checklist without missing a beat. But for Clara, time moved differently now. Slower, heavier, more honest. She hadn't slept. Her phone lay face down on the bedside table, silence long ago. She had stopped reading the comments, stopped replying to messages that weren't actually about support. Just morbid curiosity dressed as concern. The airline had already pulled her employee access from every portal. Her airline email had been deactivated. The uniform, once crisp and ironed with pride, hung awkwardly on a door or knob in her hallway like it belonged to a stranger. She wandered through her apartment aimlessly. The walls were filled with framed photos from layovers, crew dinners, training graduations, smiling faces, proud poses. But now, each frame looked less like a celebration and more like a collection of moments held hostage by a person she no longer recognized. She stopped in front of one picture. It was taken during her 5th year. She was in uniform, standing tall beside a captain on the tarmac, the aircraft shining behind them. She looked confident, solid. She remembered thinking back then, "I've made it." But what had she really made a career that lasted 12 years and ended in 12 seconds? Not because of one passenger, not because of one family, but because of a habit, a pattern of believing that power came with the right to decide who was worthy. She poured herself a coffee. The silence in her apartment stretching wide, her TV remained off, the curtains half closed. Outside, life carried on. But inside, the memory of the flight wouldn't leave her. She couldn't forget the daughter's confused eyes looking up and asking, "Why can't we go in?" Or the mother's quiet grace, how she never raised her voice, not once. Or the son standing still, dignified beyond his years, watching every word. And most of all, the father, Stephen. So calm, so still, so certain. He hadn't needed volume. He hadn't needed anger. He had simply acted. He made one phone call, and in doing so, he didn't just change her fate, he revealed it. Clara thought back to the final moment when she walked past him at the jet bridge, escorted like a criminal. He hadn't smirked. He hadn't gloated. He had just watched her eyes, calm, quiet, like he wasn't angry at her, like he was simply disappointed. And that disappointment had been more cutting than anything else. She opened her laptop instinctively, typing in the airline's crew login portal, only to be met with an error, access denied, employee ID not found. Her throat tightened. There was no undoing what had happened, no appeal, no second chance. She opened a blank document, no plan, no purpose, just an impulse. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a long time before she started typing. To the Moore family. She stopped, breathed, then kept going. You don't know me beyond a few terrible minutes, but I now realize I never saw you clearly. I didn't see the father trying to protect his family. I didn't see the mother holding her daughter's hand. I didn't see the boy who stood there with more composure than I did. I saw something else, because I was trained to by the industry, by repetition, but mostly by myself. She paused, then continued. I was wrong, and I deserve every consequence. But I wanted to say this, because no one forced me to. Because sometimes the deepest lessons come from the people we try hardest to ignore. You showed the world what real strength looks like. Quiet, unwavering strength. I hope your children grow up remembering that moment, not as a humiliation, but as a reminder of how dignity wins, even when the world tries to deny it a seat. She hit save, but she didn't send it. She didn't know where to send it, and maybe she didn't deserve to, but she needed to write it. She closed the laptop, sat back, and let herself feel the weight of it all. Not for pity, not for redemption, just for truth. Sarah Coleman's fall wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, silent, and sharp, unfolding in real time. Exposed not by scandal, but by a single moment that finally held her accountable. And the people who changed everything, they didn't shout, they didn't argue, they didn't even raise their voices, they simply stood where they had every right to stand and waited. And now the world had seen the truth. Not just about one flight attendant, but about an entire culture of quiet bias hidden behind uniforms and policies. One man made one call, and the plane didn't just stop. It opened eyes, and for Sarah Coleman, that was the moment everything finally landed. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories coming soon. The story of Clara and the Moore family teaches us that prejudice and disrespect can have dire consequences, while calmness and dignity bring true strength. Clara, because of her mistaken assumption about the Moore family, based on their appearance, lost her career reputation and position. In contrast, the Moore family, with calmness and a simple call, not only asserted their rights, but also exposed a larger problem. Prejudice hidden in behavior and policy. Do not judge others based on appearances or personal bias. Respect for all people, regardless of background or circumstances, is the foundation of a just society. Humility and the ability to admit mistakes are key to personal growth and avoiding repeating mistakes. In today's American society, the problem of racism and prejudice remains a major challenge. Similar incidents, whether in the airline industry, the workplace, or everyday life, regularly surface on social media, holding individuals and organizations accountable. This story is a reminder that every action, no matter how small, can have a big impact, especially when technology records and disseminates it quickly. In your personal life, listen and verify before jumping to conclusions. In the workplace, treat colleagues and customers fairly. As a community member, speak out against injustice calmly but firmly. By practicing respect and humility, we build a more inclusive society that is true to modern American values.